It's the early 1920s, and something had changed in Palestine. The British are barely settled into their new role as rulers of this fractured land, and already it's slipping through their fingers. The Ottoman Empire is gone, dead and buried, but the ghosts it left behind are still haunting the streets of Jerusalem and Jaffa. The riots of 1920 and 1921 and the blood spilled in the Holy Land weren't just isolated outbursts. They were warnings. They were early flare-ups of something deeper, darker, something more permanent. Because what we start to see in this moment, just a few years after the Balfour Declaration, is that two national movements aren't just living side by side. They're on a collision course. Both believe they have history, justice, and survival on their side, and both are increasingly convinced that the other's very presence is a threat to their future. This isn't just about angry crowds or fiery speeches anymore. It's about the quiet hardening of positions, the slow closing of doors that might once have been left open, and in the middle of it all, the British, fumbling with policy papers while the ground beneath them starts to tremble. This is where the story really starts to shift. Not with declarations or diplomacy, but with fear, distrust, and the realization on all sides that something irreversible may already be underway. And so with all of that in mind, let's dive back into a critique of Episode 4 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, a miniseries by Darryl Cooper for the Martyr Made podcast that covers the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Our story opens in 1924. There's just been a tremendous amount of violence in the region with the Nebi Musa riots in 1920 and the Jaffa riots in 1921. Tension is in the air in Mandatory Palestine. But the two communities, for the most part, have settled down after the repeated bouts of violence. The individual Cooper decides to hone in on in the opening salvo of this episode is Jacob Israel Dhan. Dhan was born in 1881 to a Dutch Jewish family in the Netherlands. He studied law, but instead of becoming a practicing attorney, would focus on teaching and writing. Dhan went to Russia in 1912 and witnessed the intolerable conditions that Russian Jews were subjected to in the Pale of Settlement. As we've covered before, the Jews were treated as second-class citizens with severely restricted rights compared to their fellow non-Jewish neighbors. This experience seems to have ignited something within him, a passion for his Jewish identity and Zionism. When you witness the world turning against your people, that's a pretty natural response. You circle the wagons and reconnect with those in your community. Cooper tells us, quote, Dhan came to Palestine in 1919. He is just on fire with passion for the Zionist project. He's been described as a fanatic during this period, end quote. Cooper then shares that something changed after Dhan showed up in Palestine and that he became alarmed with what he saw. He says, quote, he fell in love with the Orthodox community and began to speak out publicly against the behavior of the Zionists in Palestine. He began to join other Orthodox Jews in denouncing the Zionist plan altogether. They didn't like the idea of establishing a secular political state in the midst of an Arab country. They all looked forward to the re-establishment of the Kingdom of Israel, but they believed that would come in God's time, end quote. Cooper goes on about Dhan, quote, as 1920 and 1921 brought Arab riots, Dhan wrote sympathetically of the Jews who suffered, but he also blamed the hardline Zionists for provoking the Arabs. Soon, he was going outside normal Zionist channels and power structures altogether, meeting with Arab leaders and trying to negotiate separate agreements on behalf of the religious Jews who only wanted to gather in Palestine to worship and had no political designs, end quote. If you're wondering at this point, why does this guy matter, and why is Cooper spending so much time on him, that's fair. Let me cut to the chase. Dhan was assassinated on June 30th, 1924 by Avraham Tahomi, a man who would go on to become one of the founders of the Irgun, the paramilitary organization that caused the British a lot of grief in the lead-up to their withdrawal from Mandatory Palestine in 1948. Many would claim that they actually propelled the British down this course of action. Cooper focuses on Dhan in another attempt to demonize the Zionists and to imply that if you weren't in lockstep with them, they'd take things to the extreme. This fits with his attempts in prior episodes and this current one, as you'll see, to frame Zionism as a radical reactionist ideology akin to Marxism and Bolshevism. He repeats this train of thought again in this episode when he says, quote, "They were revolutionaries who chose Jewish nationalism over communism and other movements, but they were revolutionaries drawn from the same pool of candidates who were feeding those other movements, who were holding guns in the civil war in Russia and destabilizing countries all over Europe." End quote. This isn't the first or the second time he said this. His rhetorical approach here is intentional and intends to group all of these ideologies together into the same bucket to make Zionism seem extreme. He's throwing all of them into the same blender and hitting the on button. We covered this in episode 1, so I'm not going to dwell too much on this again, but suffice it to say that the scope of Marxism and communism was global. At a high level, the intention was to inspire worker-led revolutions and overthrow current systems of governance. Zionism is and was fairly limited in scope to a geographic region with the intention of seeking safety for a historically persecuted group of people. Completely different scope and intentions. The focus on Dhan is an attempt at further demonization by pointing to the assassination and saying, hey, look at how oppressive the Zionists are. Look at what they do to their own people who step out of line, or something like that. Now look, assassinating people is a bad thing, obviously. But there's some important context behind Dhan's assassination that Cooper leaves out that's material. He wasn't just an outspoken anti-Zionist. And he wasn't just meeting with Arab leaders to negotiate on behalf of religious Jews. There's more to the story, and Cooper's characterization leaves a lot of this detail out. So let's get one thing straight. Dhan wanted to be a power broker. When we discussed the early modern Zionist leadership previously, we spoke about guys like Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, and it's clear that Dhan viewed himself as an equal to these men. When he came to Palestine initially, he wanted to be at the top of the food chain. Ido Harari, a researcher of modern Jewish thought at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, tells us that, quote, when Dhan arrived in Palestine, he wrote a letter to Chaim Weizmann offering his services to the Zionist movement, but they were uninterested. This rejection played some part in his decision to distance himself from the emerging Zionist establishment, end quote. Harari goes on, quote, in some ways this sounds reductionist, but in a sense he began to say to the so-called new Yeshuv leaders, if you don't want me, well, I'm going to take my business elsewhere, end quote. So right out of the gate, we have someone that feels like they weren't allowed to sit at the cool kids table, and he has a chip on his shoulder as a result. And after this rejection, Dhan would join Jerusalem's ultra-Orthodox sect and found within it an anti-Zionist group. Now look, I can't read minds, especially those of dead people, but for Dhan to do a total 180 here from being ultra-pro-Zionist to an anti-Zionist soon after being rejected by Weizmann, that has to give you pause. Was his change of heart really because he believed that founding a Jewish state was the wrong move, or was it because he felt humiliated by his rejection by Jewish leadership? It gets even crazier. Dhan wasn't just outspoken against Zionism. He started taking real, concrete steps to undermine the creation of a Jewish state, the objective of the mainstream Zionist leaders like Weizmann and Ben-Gurion. Dhan initiated and held meetings with Arab leaders in surrounding countries to discuss the future of the region and its implications for the Jews. In 1923, he met with Emir Abdullah, the leader of Transjordan, to discuss forming a coalition of nationalist Arabs and anti-Zionist Jews in Palestine that would have offered full political and civil rights for Jews under the umbrella of an Arab state. Abdullah told Dhan that he wouldn't support a Jewish state in Palestine, but that he considered the anti-Zionist Jews as allies to the Arabs. Abdullah went on to sign a declaration welcoming any Jewish immigrants to Palestine as long as they rejected Zionism and the establishment of a Jewish state. Dhan held another meeting with Abdullah's father, Sharif Hussein of Mecca. They met in Amman in February 1924. Faisal, Hussein's other son, told him at this meeting, quote, "In Palestine, our partners in government will be the ultra-Orthodox Jews, because we trust them not to destroy the foundations of education and modesty of our sons and daughters." End quote. So Dhan emerges from these meetings with Hussein and his sons promising to form a partnership with them and the anti-Zionist separatist Jews, and he even received a meaty financial donation from them to help fund separatist institutions in Jerusalem. Dhan then went back to Amman a few months later and got Hussein to issue a public statement that denounced the, quote, anti-religious Zionist movement, end quote, for its mistreatment of faithful Muslims, Christians, and Orthodox Jews. Again, just to be clear, I'm not justifying Dhan's assassination here, but this context is important because it demonstrates that he was taking real, concrete steps with hostile powers surrounding the Jewish community in Mandatory Palestine, powers that would later invade the country in an attempt to destroy it. This wasn't just a question of suppressing contrary opinions. Dhan was actively working to undercut the Zionist leadership just as it was starting to gain its footing. This is all vital context that Cooper doesn't even mention. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this next claim because there's just so much to get through, but at this point in this miniseries, if you've made it this far, first of all, well done, but also it's probably clear by now that Cooper has an animus here. And sometimes he makes these little one-off pinprick remarks. They're not even really the focus of the segment that he's currently in the middle of. They remind me of water torture, those devices where you would take someone and put them under a dripping machine. The victim was never physically tortured, they'd just have a constant drip, drip, drip of water hitting them on their head. They wouldn't be able to sleep, and sometimes the pattern of the drops was hard to predict, so the victims would go crazy. This is one of those drips. Cooper says in the aftermath of Dhan's assassination, quote, "Things were changing for the Zionist movement. Chaim Weizmann was still at the center of the movement worldwide, having almost single-handedly gotten the British to destroy the Ottoman Empire and issue the Balfour Declaration." End quote. We covered some of the history here previously, and yes, Weizmann was pretty important in using his influence and notoriety to get the British political establishment on side with the Zionist movement during World War I, which ultimately culminated in the Balfour Declaration supporting a Jewish national home in Palestine in 1917. But do you recall how he got that notoriety? We covered it briefly in episode 1. He invented a new method of fermenting acetone, an important component in making propellants used in British munitions. This process became vital to ensuring Allied supply chains had the means to feed hungry weapons during the war. Thing is, though, Weizmann invented this process at his lab in Manchester once the war had already started, and the need for acetone became evident. This happened between 1915 to 1916, before Weizmann had achieved the zenith of his influence. The Ottomans decided, in conjunction with their German allies, to attack the Russian Black Sea Fleet in a surprise raid in October 1914. This prompted the British to declare war on the Ottomans the next month in November 1914. And it was the Ottomans themselves who first attacked the British when they tried and spectacularly failed to cross the Suez Canal in February 1915 to attack British Egypt. So here again, the timeline just doesn't align, just like it didn't align with Faisal's travels as we discussed last episode. None of this makes sense. Claiming that Weizmann was responsible for British actions against the Ottomans doesn't gel with the historical record. And the best reason I can think of for why someone would make that claim is because they're hoping other people won't look into this further. Cooper then goes on to make some claims about Zionist immigration to the region that contradict some of his earlier statements, and in some instances are just flat out wrong. He says, quote, "After the Jaffa riots, and especially after the French came in and crushed Faisal's little kingdom of Syria, Jews around the world, these are a lot of social-minded people, a lot of people who like to think of themselves as ethical, humanitarian kind of enlightened people, and they didn't necessarily want to be involved with this colonial French government coming in and smashing up these native peasants. They didn't necessarily want anything to do with that, and so Jews around the world, especially in Western Europe and the Anglosphere, many of them started to have second thoughts about this whole Zionism thing. Arab resistance and British suspicion were problems for the Zionists. They needed to address that, but none of that would mean anything if the Zionists didn't address an even deeper problem, which was that after the Jaffa riots and the Franco-Syrian War, Jews stopped coming. Around the world, the Jewish community was already very far from unanimous about Zionism. This was a very controversial thing still within the Jewish community. There were a lot of Jews out there that they thought they were well on their way to making a life in the countries that they live in. They thought the Zionists coming in and saying, hey, we're not part of those countries, we're our own country. They didn't like that. And so it's already controversial all over the world. End quote. So Cooper is making a few points here. Let's break this down. He argues that Jewish immigration to Mandatory Palestine dipped after the Jaffa riots and the Nebi Musa riots in 1920 and 1921, and that one of the reasons for this was the fallout from the Franco-Syrian War of 1920. He also claims that adherence to Zionism wasn't uniform across the entire global Jewish population. That's the thrust of what he's saying here. And while he gets some of this right, Cooper is mostly wrong. So let's deal with adherence to Zionism first. Cooper's correct here. We covered the ultra-Orthodox religious sect in Palestine that was anti-Zionist alongside Dhan, but there were other groups outside of Palestine that were equally suspicious of the merits or viability of Zionism. In episode 1, we talked about Lucian Wolfenbüttel, a notable Jewish anti-Zionist around this time, as well as the Jewish Labor Bund, which sought integration in the diaspora as opposed to the creation of a Jewish state. It's worth noting that a lot of these Jewish anti-Zionists at the time were nervous about Zionism because they thought it would disrupt their daily lives in their home countries. They were also skeptical as to whether a path towards an actual Jewish state was feasible at all. Once Israel actually came to exist in 1948, a lot of former anti-Zionists, especially Jews that were living in the Middle East that were subsequently kicked out of their home countries, came around to Zionism and to seeing its merits after previously sitting on the fence or being anti-Zionist. So, in relation to Jewish thinking at this moment in time, Cooper gets this one. I'll give him that. But he's wrong on the rest. Let's talk about immigration and the Franco-Syrian War. In the aftermath of the Jaffa and Nebi Musa riots, Jewish immigration did dip. There's a few reasons why this happened. First and most obvious was the violence itself. People generally don't want to immigrate to places where there's instability as soon as they arrive, unless they have no other choice. The brutality witnessed in 1920 and 1921 likely discouraged some immigrants. In addition to that, a 1922 British white paper introduced the concept of absorptive economic capacity, which meant that an economic review based on available housing and jobs would be conducted before allowing new Jewish immigrants into Palestine. This had an immediate and significant impact on immigration, especially during the early 1920s, when the region was grappling with an economic crisis. This was also done to placate local Arab animosity surrounding Jewish immigration. So, yes, in the aftermath of the Nebi Musa and Jaffa riots, there was a dip in Jewish immigration, but this wasn't exclusively because of the violence. A significant part of it was also due to British policies limiting entry, regardless of Jewish eagerness to move to Palestine, and notably, we see this trend reverse quickly in 1924. By this year, the economic conditions of the Mandate were improving, and absorptive capacity was rising, which meant that the British were open to permitting more Jewish immigrants. 1924 was also the year the Johnson-Reed Act became law in the United States, sharply restricting overall immigration. At the same time, Poland implemented the Grabski tax reforms, which disproportionately targeted Jewish businesses. These measures acted as significant push factors, prompting many Jews, especially from Poland, to seek refuge and economic stability in Palestine. This shift marked the beginning of a fourth wave of Jewish immigration to the region. These factors combined to sharply reduce Jewish migration to traditional destinations like the US, increase emigration from Poland, and increase Jewish immigration to Palestine. We actually see a shift in the number of arrivals to the Mandate that correspond with this timeline. Roughly 8,300 Jews arrived in 1921, about 7,600 in 1922, only 2,100 in 1923, and then roughly 14,000 in 1924. This aligns precisely with these economic and political changes. So, no, Jews weren't staying away from Palestine. They were being prevented from entering due to British policies, and then when conditions changed, they came in significant numbers because other viable options were closed to them. And as for the Franco-Syrian War being a motivating factor for the dip in immigration, that claim doesn't hold any water. The Jews weren't trying to move to Syria, and what happened in Damascus didn't drive Jewish decisions about Palestine. The British, not the French, controlled the Mandate. The Franco-Syrian War isn't relevant to Jewish immigration patterns here. This feels like a complete red herring. Cooper repeats the poorly framed claim that we spoke about last episode surrounding Ottoman-Arab relations when he says, quote, "The Arabs make their deal with the British during the First World War and agree to put themselves on the line, really put themselves at risk, and revolt against the Muslim Ottoman Empire that was not that bad in exchange for a guarantee that an independent Arab government would be set up over Arab lands after the war." End quote. We discussed this at length previously, but that same Muslim Ottoman Empire was planning on putting quite a few Muslim skulls on pikes if you asked any of the leading members of the Hashemites, who the CUP, the leaders of the Ottoman Empire, were planning on executing before hostilities broke out in World War I. We won't dwell here too long as we've covered this extensively, but Cooper's framing here is intentional. He's pointing out how the Muslim Ottomans have more in common with the Arabs by virtue of their shared religion, and he therefore casts them in a more indigenous light, despite the fact that the Turks themselves colonized Arab lands. This framing is intentional, as it's meant to castigate the British as colonizers for taking over Ottoman territory after they were attacked by the Ottomans first. You of course can't talk about the history of this conflict without talking about land. Cooper takes us down this path with the following, quote, "The Zionists actually use this really interesting and effective kind of two-pronged strategy. All the big stuff, land acquisition, immigrant policy, control over the holy places, all this stuff the Zionists were determined to work behind the scenes quietly. But at the same time, they made a point to dispute every little inconsequential detail about Palestine's identity in daily life. There are a ton of these accounts of committees and debates that are being put together by the British for the Arabs and the Zionists to argue over what certain landmarks or towns should be called. Stuff like that. And the Zionists would just push the Arabs on everything." End quote. I don't really think most people would take issue with Cooper's claim here, that there were disputes between Arabs and Jews over municipal matters. I do think his framing here is intentionally one-sided and misses the mark, as everyone wanted to put their stake in the ground around this time when it came to language usage and naming conventions. After all, the Arabs and Jews were trying to nation build, but I think the real issue here is how he talks about the big things like land purchases. The purchase of land was a contentious issue that traced its roots to the 19th century. In 1858, the Ottomans passed land reforms that formally registered plots, categorized them, and created an official land registry. One of the biggest changes stemming from this was that land could now effectively be bought and sold by private individuals. So, when Jews raised money for land purchases through organizations like the Jewish National Fund, they were able to acquire that land, but these real estate transactions weren't shady backroom deals. As historian Benny Morris puts it, quote, "Many nationalist Palestinian families sold land to Jews, and an element of guilt probably underlay at least some Arab leaders' vituperation against Zionism. Arab politicians and media attacked such sellers, declaring that by selling land they saw the blood and remains of their fathers and charged them with being dazzled by Zionist gold. Of 29 members of the Palestine Arab Executive, this was the governing body of Arabs in Palestine, between 1920 and June 1928, at least 1/4 sold land to Jews, or facilitated and benefited financially from such purchases, including the PAE's president from 1920 until 1934, Musa Kazim al-Husseini, and Raghib al-Nashashibi, the mayor of Jerusalem from 1920 to 1934. Zionist land purchases were limited not by available supply and Arab readiness to sell so much as by shortage of funds. According to historian Kenneth Stein, the quantity of Arab land offered for sale was far in excess of the Jewish ability to purchase. His conclusion was that Arab land sales meant the absence of true commitment to Palestinian nationalism. Individual priorities were equal to or more important than an emerging national movement. Economic survival was the paramount motivation, end quote. So you had the literal leaders of the Palestine Arab Executive, the highest notables in the land, the people responsible for political decisions that would impact the Arabs of Palestine, selling land to the Jews for their own benefit. This isn't something that you can just hide. Imagine a situation where you have a high-ranking politician, someone that everyone knows, that owns a lot of land. And then all of a sudden, you see new people on their territory building a new house or planting some crops. That's something people are going to notice, right? So this whole obfuscation that these deals were hidden or secretive is really nothing more than an attempt to get another jab in at the Zionists here. Now look, I'm not saying that these transactions didn't cause tension in the region. They absolutely did. Traditionally, before an increase in Jewish immigration, Arab tenant farmers known as fellahin would work the land of their landlords and pay them rents. These people and their families would be renting their plots of land for generations in some cases, and when the Jews started buying up land, a lot of these fellahin were evicted, and they really didn't understand why. Were the Jews in their rights as the new landlords to do that? Of course they were. Did it cause a tremendous amount of resentment? Of course it did. Despite this, there were attempts at peacemaking happening in the aftermath of the Troubles of 1920 to 1921. There was a conference held in November 1921 in London that the British organized, and Chaim Weizmann, as the president of the Zionist organization, was meeting with Arab leaders who, as usual, were maximalist and demanded an abandonment of the Balfour Declaration and a complete halt to Jewish immigration. Benny Morris characterizes this period with the following, quote, "The main obstacle was the reluctance of the Arab leadership to join in sincere and open or even covert dialogue. None of the peace contacts during the 1920s appears to have been initiated by the Arabs. All or nearly all Arabs sought not coexistence but the Yeshuv's disappearance. Those who did maintain contacts usually did so for bribes, and the few who were willing to reach an agreement as a result of certain empathy with the Jews, or as was more common, out of a feeling that Zionism backed by Whitehall was unbeatable, were intimidated into silence by the hardliners." End quote. We talked about the Husseini-Nashashibi rivalry previously, and how it was emblematic of the different approaches to dealing with the Zionists. How the Husseini family were maximalists and the Nashashibis moderates. You see that playing out here. You see the impacts of it given Morse's commentary. The moderates were sidelined, the Jews were likely more defensive because of that in the aftermath of what transpired in the early 1920s, and they probably said, all right, we're really not getting anywhere with this. Let's just keep legally buying up this land from Arabs that are willing to sell it to us. We'll continue to do our own thing, and when they come around wanting to make some form of a compromise with us that doesn't involve kicking us out, we'll figure something out. But of course, that isn't how things unfolded. One of the things that has to be mentioned here is the word colonization. Cooper brings this up repeatedly, and a lot of people do these days when it comes to talking about this conflict. In the 1920s, we were living in a world where nations like Britain and even the United States had actual colonies. There are different ways to define the word colonization, but I'm just going to give you the Merriam-Webster definition. It defines colonization as the establishment of a colony and the subjugation of a people or area, especially as an extension of state power. The element of state-backed subjugation is critical when discussing colonization. If you consider examples like Australia under the British or the Spanish conquistadors in Central America, the model was straightforward. Territories were seized on behalf of the crown, resources were extracted for a foreign state, and local populations were often forced into subservience or servitude to drive that economic exploitation. That isn't what we're seeing in Palestine. The Jews weren't migrating on behalf of an imperial state. They weren't doing it for the crown or for Whitehall. They were coming because they had nowhere else to go, an existential flight, not a leisurely one. Cooper himself repeatedly mentions that many Jewish villages and towns consciously refused to hire Arab labor. These 2 points, the nature of the migration and its economic patterns, stand in stark contrast to the traditional understanding of colonization. It's important to note that in the 1920s, the term itself didn't carry the negative undertones it does today. The British government had an entire department called the Colonial Office, and the term was used openly. The Zionist movement itself used the word frequently when referring to Jewish immigration to Palestine. Notably, one of its seminal leaders, who we'll be covering shortly, uses the term extensively in his own writings. At the time, colonization didn't always imply brutal conquest or exploitation as it does now. It was a more neutral term and often the only available one to describe the phenomenon of moving to a new place and building a community. At the time, the term was used frequently to refer to Jewish immigration to Palestine, but I would propose that that word was chosen because there simply wasn't a better alternative. There was obviously some pattern recognition at play here. You have people from other places moving to a new place, and so that sort of overlaps with state-driven colonization. But as we just discussed, none of the other pieces really fit neatly. We have examples from the period that show how broadly the term was used. A Jewish Daily Bulletin excerpt from September 21st, 1926 announced the following, quote, "Colonization work for Arabs in Palestine was undertaken by the Muslim Supreme Council, a religious body. It was announced that the council will establish an Arab colony at Reuben near Jaffa on a strip of land of 32,400 dunams. The land is Waqf land, religious property bequeathed to the Muslim authorities. The council plans to establish the first Arab agricultural school." End quote. Here's a clear example of the term colonization being used during the time period we're covering, and all that it's really implying was that Arab land in Mandatory Palestine was being developed for an agricultural school. It's not being used in reference to a native people being subjugated or kicked off their land, or soldiers banging down doors with axes. Its use here is fairly mild and tame. This is a very different connotation compared to how colonization is used today. And so the takeaway is really this. When we talk about land acquisition in Palestine, and when you see the word colonization being weaponized by people today in relation to this conflict, you need to remember, and feel free to remind people of this, that words generally, but this word specifically, evolved over time. Even when all of this was happening in the 1920s, the word colonization was used in very different contexts to refer to very different things. It could mean brutal occupation, subjugation, and death, but it could also mean buying some land to plant some olive trees or to harvest citrus. Cooper then pivots to a bit of a deep dive on a guy by the name of Zev Jabotinsky. Now, we've previously covered two of the main leaders of the Zionist movement in the 1920s, Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion. Both of these leaders were fairly mainstream, with Ben-Gurion being to the left of Weizmann politically. In the early 1920s, we see Jabotinsky's prominence rise, and there's a very straightforward reason for that. Here's how Cooper characterizes Jabotinsky. Quote, Jabotinsky broke from Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, forming the Revisionist Party, referring to their rejection of any revisions to the territory of Greater Israel. End quote. The Greater Israel that Cooper is referring to here was the belief by some right-wing Zionists that the British Mandate would cover both modern Israel and Jordan. The hope was dashed in 1921 when the British split off Jordan into its own territory. Figures like Ben-Gurion and Weizmann reluctantly accepted this, but Jabotinsky and others on the right thought it was unjust. Cooper continues, quote, after leaving the mainstream Zionist organization and forming the Revisionist Party, Jabotinsky forms the Beitar paramilitary youth organization. This is a right-wing militant organization dedicated to preparing for what he saw as the inevitable war over Palestine. End quote. This characterization on Cooper's part is largely accurate. Compared to Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, Jabotinsky was militant in his approach to forming a state in the region, but I think there's some additional context missing here. Jabotinsky's magnum opus is an essay published in November 1923 called The Iron Wall. Within it, he advocates for the use of military force to secure Jewish immigration to the region. But we have to bear in mind when he's saying these things. This is just 2 years after widespread violence between Jews and Arabs, the Nebi Musa and Jaffa riots that left the Jewish community deeply shaken. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and the rise of a right-wing militant flank within the Zionist camp was hardly surprising given this context. Now, Cooper quotes extensively from Jabotinsky's Iron Wall essay, and I'm not going to go through all of that here. To summarize, Jabotinsky basically stated that the Arabs would never accept the Jewish majority in Palestine as long as they had any hope of defeating the Jews. So an iron wall of military strength needed to be built. Only once that wall was established, genuine negotiations and peace would then become possible. What I find interesting, though, is the conclusion of this essay. We've been through a plethora of moments where Cooper has misquoted or misconstrued sources, and this is another one of those times. Let's examine how Cooper covers the end of Jabotinsky's essay. He cites Jabotinsky directly, quote, either Zionism is moral and just, or it is immoral and unjust, but that is a question we should have settled before we became Zionists. Actually, we have settled that question, and in the affirmative. We hold that Zionism is moral and just, and since it is moral and just, justice must be done no matter whether Joseph, or Simon, or Ivan, or Ahmed agrees with it, or not. There is no other morality in the second place. This does not mean that there cannot be any agreement with the Palestinian Arabs. What is impossible is a voluntary agreement. As long as the Arabs feel that there is at least hope of getting rid of us, they will refuse to accept this hope in return for either kind words or for bread and butter, because they are not a rabble, but a living people. And when a living people yields in matters of such vital character, it is only when there is no longer any hope of getting rid of us, because they can make no breach in the iron wall. End quote. So that's pretty much how I characterize Jabotinsky, right? He argues that a militaristic solution was needed to ensure that Jewish immigration could continue, with this coming on the heels of unprecedented intercommunal violence in the region. But what's interesting here is that this isn't actually where the essay ends. There's more, and I want to quote the actual ending that Cooper completely omits here. This concluding portion immediately follows the excerpt Cooper quotes. This is how Jabotinsky wraps things up. Quote, "Not till then will they drop their extremist leaders whose watchword is never, and the leadership will pass to the moderate groups, who will approach us with a proposal that we should both agree to mutual concessions. Then we may expect them to discuss honestly practical questions, such as a guarantee against Arab displacement, or equal rights for Arab citizens, or Arab national integrity. And when that happens, I am convinced that we Jews will be found ready to give them satisfactory guarantees so that both peoples can live together in peace, like good neighbors. But the only way to obtain such an agreement is the Iron Wall, which is to say a strong power in Palestine that is not amenable to any Arab pressure. In other words, the only way to reach an agreement in the future is to abandon all idea of seeking an agreement at present." End quote. Cooper leaves this part out, and I think that's pretty egregious, honestly, because what this tells us is that in a world where the Nebi Musa and Jaffa riots didn't happen, there's a real possibility that Jabotinsky may have been more aligned with Ben-Gurion and Weizmann. What he's saying is that he actually wanted to come to a conclusion with the Arabs in Palestine that would allow both peoples to live side by side, where both offer concessions. But after the violence he witnessed, he didn't think this was feasible in the short term. Now, Jabotinsky was by no means a moderate. He and his followers engaged in brutal revenge attacks against Arabs. But here he is, in his seminal work, the piece that launched his career and defined his legacy, saying clearly, "I'm open to making peace with the Arabs, and a negotiated settlement, but our people need a place to go, and we were promised by those controlling this territory that we could make a home here. We accept guarantees for Arab rights, their national integrity, and protection from displacement, but we don't yet have a partner on the other side of the table, willing to accept that reality alongside us." So once again, Cooper is selectively quoting and leaving out critical parts of the works he cites because they don't fit the story he's trying to tell, falling intentionally or not, and by now you can certainly decide this for yourself, into one of my biggest pet peeves about the history of this entire conflict. It's the tendency for people to look into something happening as if it lives in a vacuum, as if Jabotinsky appeared out of thin air with a more militant approach to the problem the Jews in Palestine were facing, when in reality there's a plethora of inflection points that got us to this moment. Anyways, let's continue. There's another quote from episode 4 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem that I want to read to you. It clearly outlines how Cooper is thinking about Jewish immigration to the region. I find it particularly surprising considering that Cooper spent so much time in episode 1 talking about the Jewish experience prior to immigration to Palestine in the 19th century. He says, quote, "What you need to understand about the Zionist, what I should have emphasized more and what you have to keep in mind for the rest of this story is that the Zionists are not just a bunch of immigrants trickling into the country and sort of trying to figure it out as they go along. No, they are an organized revolutionary movement. The Zionists in Palestine, the people who are actually immigrating and moving there, they're just the frontline troops of an international organization with the financial backing of some of the wealthiest families and individuals in the entire world, as well as the support of major European nations. They've got people all over Europe recruiting young Jewish men and bringing them to training centers that they're setting up in different parts of Europe to prepare them for their move to Palestine. I mean, we mentioned the Rothschild family a couple times. Many of them were financial backers of the Zionist project." End quote. An organized revolutionary movement, frontline troops. It's clear that the characterization Cooper is gunning for here is a militant foreign invasion. He's back to his tiresome refrain of painting the Zionists in the same light as the Marxists and Bolsheviks. Who is the Zionist revolution against? Who are they overthrowing? It just doesn't fit the mold at all. Cooper's trying to paint a picture here as if the immigrating Jews were storming beaches on D-Day with an armada of battleships shelling Arab towns in their wake. As if the Rothschilds are funding an army to seize territory administered by the British for no reason other than conquest. As if everything we've covered in previous episodes surrounding the historical treatment of Jews in Europe and the Middle East didn't exist. The options available weren't many: go somewhere, or maintain an untenable status quo. A devil's advocate might say, well, two things can be true. Jews were historically persecuted and needed somewhere to go, but that doesn't erase the rights of Arabs already living there. Most people with a rational view would agree. Yet, it's worth remembering that we now live in a very different world compared to the mid-20th century. We touched on this in episode 2, but this was a time when masses of people were moving across borders. At the end of World War II, roughly 2 million Germans moved from East Prussia to Germany proper, and when India and Pakistan were partitioned, some 15 million people were on the move. This isn't a pleasant thing. It means uprooting families and reshaping lives, but the notion that the partition of the Palestine Mandate was somehow unique, unprecedented, or unlike anything else in history simply doesn't hold up. Do you remember at the end of our last episode together, the one where we broke down why Cooper was spending all of that time focusing on how states achieve legitimacy and how they lose it? And I told you then, and I promise I didn't skip ahead and listen to the installment we're covering today. I told you then that I think Cooper was focusing on the destruction of state legitimacy because he was going to use that as a justification for Arabs in the region turning to violence as an outlet for their frustration. Well, here we are. The characterization of the Zionists as a foreign army rather than people fleeing persecution is exactly the kind of language I would have expected to see as justification for what we've seen in our story so far and what's yet to come. Cooper says this pretty plainly. He cites a source with the following, quote, "The initiative in firing the first shot must always lie with the Arabs, and this would be an offensive action. The British government would necessarily have to resist the Arabs and defend the Jews. Arab action, although of an essentially defensive nature, therefore always appeared to be offensive in the eyes of the British public, and Zionist action, which was of an essentially offensive nature, always appeared as defensive." End quote. So this is basically a 1-2 punch from Cooper. The governing authority, according to him, has lost legitimacy due to its biases toward the Zionists, and the Arabs have no other choice other than to turn to violence because of it. There's no legitimacy given to Zionist claims pursuant to the Balfour Declaration. There's no reference here to the fact that they were legally buying up land that the Arabs were willingly selling them during this period. And there's no acknowledgement of the fact that this territory was not a country before World War I. As we just discussed, divisions of territory and population transfers, especially when new countries like Jordan, Syria, India, and Pakistan are created, that was the norm, rather than the exception, in the 20th century. A new argument that Cooper brings up, which is rather noteworthy, is the timing of all of this, and why the Jews are coming to Palestine when they are. In Cooper's own words, quote, "Part of the reason Zionism took hold when it did in the late 19th century was not only that the situation of the Jews was difficult in many places, it had always been difficult. No, it was the ramping up of their difficulties in the East combined with the sudden emergence of some other places like the United States and Britain and eventually the Soviet Union that weren't such bad places for a Jewish person. And that created an existential panic among people who were committed to this Jewish national identity." End quote. This line of reasoning is remarkably myopic. His argument is basically, yes, Jews were persecuted for centuries, but because a few other countries were becoming viable destinations, Zionist leaders felt compelled to pounce. As if their goal was to claim Palestine before Jews opted for the United States. This oversimplifies the experience of these people, and for the record, Cooper doesn't refer to a source when walking us through this. Since the Romans exiled the Judeans, Jews had been subject to a long history of wandering, expulsions, discrimination, and pogroms. Existence that was totally reliant upon the whims of the rulers and populations they lived alongside. Against that backdrop, it's entirely plausible that many Jews would have said to themselves, "You know what? It's time to put an end to the pinball machine that is our existence. We're tired of being bounced around everywhere and subjected to the whims of governments that may like us or hate us. It's time to pursue self-determination on our own terms." This doesn't conflict with the fact that certain countries like the United States were emerging as viable destinations for Jews. I mean, the Zionists were following in the footsteps of Theodor Herzl, who had witnessed and learned how safe nations could quickly turn hostile. Anti-Jewish riots in France broke out during the Dreyfus trial, and Poland, a longtime refuge for Jews, became subject to Russian policies and pogroms. The fact Cooper mentions the USSR as a viable option here is a dead giveaway he's out of his depth in this area of study. As the Soviet Union was taking its first steps, the Communist Party established a branch whose entire goal was to employ good Jews that sought to erase any sign of uniquely Jewish culture in the Soviet Union. They shut down schools that taught Hebrew, destroyed Jewish community organizations, and staged show trials on Jewish holidays where Judaism and Zionism was denounced. The Yevoksektsiya allowed the Soviets to claim that they weren't persecuting Jews because it was Jews themselves employed by the Bureau that were doing the persecution themselves, and it did so until 1929 when it was abolished. So here you have a purported safe nation for Jews that Cooper highlights that was trying to erase any signs of Jewishness. It's really not that crazy to think that Herzl and those that followed in his footsteps would have examined immigration opportunities and concluded, look, it's great that there are other options, but it's time for us to be the masters of our own destiny. This doesn't mean mainstream Zionist leaders were panicked about Jewish emigration to the United States or Britain. It means that their goal was to secure a state where Jewish identity and survival weren't reliant on the whims or tolerance of host nations. Cooper actually addresses this head-on in a way that I think is pretty twisted, honestly. In relation to Jews outside of Palestine in the 1920s, he says that Zionists said the following, quote, "They looked around Europe and Russia and they said, look, I know things seem okay now. They've seemed okay before, okay? They've been looking up before. These people will turn on you. Things are easy right now. The stock market's booming, people are making money, but they won't always be easy. And when things get hard, you'll see these people are your enemy. They are your enemy. And you need to get out and come help us in Palestine while you still have a choice." That's the way they thought about it. They did not buy it, but all through the 1920s, that was not a message that was resonating. A lot of Jews did not want to hear it. A lot of them were getting irritated with the Zionists. They were trying to shut them up like, dude, things have been going pretty well. If anything is going to piss these people off and make them turn on us, it's going to be you running around ranting about them being our enemies. End quote. Well, as we just covered, these purportedly safe countries didn't need the Zionists as an excuse to do just that. One can't help but see the short-sightedness of Cooper's characterization here, when by the end of this decade the Holocaust was less than 10 years out. It's funny. Really, Cooper's characterization here that non-Zionist Jews would tell the Zionists to stop spreading their beliefs out of fear that their neighbors would turn on them. Maybe Cooper just has a short memory, but a large chunk of the first episode of this miniseries was focused on the Jewish experience before the advent of political Zionism. Before Herzl, the Jews were being slaughtered and expelled in Europe and forcibly converted in the Middle East. There were, of course, some anti-Zionist Jews, like those mentioned earlier, but to think that Zionism was needed as an excuse to be used as a cudgel against Jews shows a shocking shallowness of this entire story given the history. Cooper also tries to tie in fears about assimilation, implying that Zionists were worried that Jewish identity would fade if Jews chose to go to safe haven countries like the US and UK. But many Zionist leaders were themselves highly assimilated Jews living in the very nations he mentions. Herzl was born in Hungary. Weitzman came from Belarus and lived in England, and many of the early Zionist leaders were shaped by their experience of living in liberal European nations. Yet they remained committed to their Jewish identity precisely because of their heritage, regardless of their level of assimilation. In this regard, Cooper is again mistaken, and this entire line of questioning really just falls short. Cooper then turns to the way the British government in Whitehall received information about events unfolding in Palestine. This was an especially turbulent period for the British, roughly 5 years into their administration of the Mandate and grappling with a sharp rise in violence and bloodshed. According to Cooper, much of the information reaching British leaders was filtered, presenting a sanitized version of events. He claims that many British policymakers who weren't in Palestine weren't getting the full picture of the situation on the ground. He tells us, quote, "So all of the information that the vast majority of the British public as well as the British leadership is getting is either directly from the Zionists through propaganda, through publications like The Guardian, whose editor was a committed Zionist and worked directly with Weitzman on public relations planning, or else they got it through a regular government chain of information. And how did that government chain of information work?" End quote. He goes on, in relation to people in the British government, quote, "The other members for the most part had no direct knowledge of affairs within Palestine itself, but were open to the persuasive influence which the Zionist organization was able to bring to bear through the press and parliament by personal pressure upon ministers." End quote. Cooper then uses the example of Congressman Charlie Wilson, made famous by the film about him, to highlight how, when a politician wanted information about Afghanistan in the 80s, they went to Wilson, and much of what they learned was shaped by Wilson's perspective. This analogy is meant to underscore the point that when information is filtered through an interested party, it can carry a certain slant. However, this characterization doesn't fully align with the historical record. In the aftermath of the Nebi Musa and Jaffa riots, the British set up commissions to investigate the causes of the violence. The first, the Palin Commission, issued its findings later in 1920 and concluded that tensions had boiled over due in part to Jewish immigration and land purchases, and the British authorities' role in allowing this. Similarly, the Haycraft Commission, following the Jaffa riots, came to comparable conclusions in 1921. Although the Palin report was kept confidential at the time, the Haycraft report was published openly. This is significant because it suggests that British authorities were not only wholly reliant on filtered information. In fact, their own commissions openly acknowledged that tensions were linked, at least in part, to Zionist policies and activities. This is important because it challenges Cooper's narrative. He suggests that the Zionist movement was intentionally obscuring events on the ground to bypass British authorities and keep them in the dark. In reality, British officials were producing reports that openly identified Zionist policies, including immigration and land purchases, as key drivers of the tensions. That doesn't sound like subterfuge at all. If anything, it suggests precisely the opposite. The British government was being critical of the Zionists here. As an aside, it's worth highlighting this next thing, because it's very telling about where Cooper eventually goes with this narrative and how it relates to what we now know about his commentary years after he recorded this. While discussing British policy, he singles out Winston Churchill, who served as Secretary of State for the colonies from 1921 to 1922, and he suggests that Arab grievances were ignored because Churchill was a, quote, Zionist, end quote. Yet it was under Churchill's oversight that the Haycraft Commission report was published in late 1921, a report that was hardly favorable to the Zionist position. Moreover, in 1922, Churchill issued a white paper that placed restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine. These examples underscore that British authorities were operating with a more nuanced and balanced understanding of events than Cooper implies. It's not surprising that Cooper unjustifiably throws Churchill under the bus given his recent absurd remarks about Churchill being the chief villain of World War II. Now, around this time, an organization starts to become important that Cooper highlights called the Supreme Muslim Council, or the SMC. It was created by the British and tasked with administering Islamic religious affairs in Mandatory Palestine. The head of the council, Haj Amin al-Husseini, was appointed by the British High Commissioner. You should recognize that name. I told you before it would be important. The SMC had access to religious funds, administered mosques, religious endowments, and Islamic courts, and became deeply embedded in the religious and civic life of Palestinian Muslims. They oversaw religious institutions, facilitated marriages, funerals, and other life milestones, and exercised control over messaging to everyday people. Given their control over mosques and religious leadership, their influence over the public was immense. When you control what people hear in sermons, you wield real power, and Husseini understood that. In Cooper's own words, quote, "In a place with a basically homogeneous population and culture, right, where most people around are all the same, if you ask somebody why they pray 5 times a day facing Mecca, that person would probably say because that's what we do, that's what my people do. But when the society starts getting fractured into different sections so that it's no longer homogeneous, now when you ask that person the same question, he's going to say because I'm a Muslim, and all of a sudden he's a lot more aware of his Muslim identity because there are a bunch of non-Muslims running around the country knocking things around." End quote. This quote is important because it highlights Cooper's framing of identity becoming more explicitly religious in response to rising sectarian and national tensions. As we get into the late 1920s, we see Husseini and the SMC weaponizing religious sentiment in defense of Muslim holy sites, a tactic that had both religious and political implications. Cooper tells us, quote, "He starts looking outside Palestine for help. He tries to internationalize the Palestinian national cause, and he was in a unique position to do that. Any other tribal leader couldn't go to the leaders of Transjordan or Egypt or Saudi Arabia and call on their loyalty to support his cause. They didn't owe him anything. They didn't care, but as the leader of Palestine's Muslim community, the Grand Mufti was able to call on them to do their duty as Muslims to protect the holy places if they were under threat. And so he started playing up that threat, promoting himself as the staunch defender of the Muslim holy places." End quote. The important question to be asking in response to this, obviously, is were the holy sites actually being threatened by the Jews? When talking about Muslim holy sites in the region, Cooper quotes heavily from Vincent Sheehan, a journalist who arrived in 1929 to document events in the region. He quotes Sheehan as saying the following, quote, "Sheehan wrote about the Muslim holy sites when he first arrived, and of his impressions he said, quote, the Dome of the Rock was not visited by Orthodox Jews because it was regarded by them as the holiest part of their temple, and they feared to tread unwittingly on their Holy of Holies. But Zionists, most of whom were without religious feeling, used to visit it, as I did, out of an ordinary aesthetic interest. The Muslims made no objection to such visits in this and other respects." End quote. That doesn't sound like the holy sites were under attack or threat at all to me. It sounds like some Jews were visiting the Dome of the Rock because they liked its architecture. In fact, Sheehan, who is otherwise quite critical of the Zionists and their nation-building, goes on to state exactly the opposite. He says this in a book he wrote called Personal History, which documented his time in Palestine, and notably, it's a quote that Cooper doesn't reference. He says, quote, "The Mosque of Omar was in no danger at any time during the Troubles, but Arab rumors throughout the country made it the crux of the matter." End quote. This matters because it challenges the central claim used to incite unrest, that Jewish actions threatened Islamic holy places. Cooper then jumps to August 14, 1929, when a Jewish demonstration took place near the Western Wall. Afterward, an Arab mob attacked Jews praying at the site and reportedly destroyed religious texts. Cooper's framing of this rush at the wall by the Arabs is important. He says, quote, "This isn't a bunch of hardcore Islamic fundamentalists who just can't stand other faiths, so they come to get rid of a false heathen text. No. This is just a bunch of angry young guys who saw a big crowd of other angry young guys yelling and acting tough, and so they're coming over to say, oh really? What do you think about this? Take that, and a little bit of that. All of this is two groups of increasingly rowdy young men." End quote. This is a significant minimization. What followed wasn't simply youthful rowdiness. It escalated quickly into a multi-day massacre. Cooper continues, describing August 23rd, a few days later, quote, "The Grand Mufti makes his way down to the old city, and he appears before the crowd and calls for them to settle down. He's trying to calm people down, but there was a British observer there, and he said that the Mufti's presence seemed to have the opposite of a calming effect." End quote. After this speech from the Grand Mufti, the Arab mob heads toward a group of Jewish houses, and here's how Cooper characterizes this. Quote, "You've got a crowd of really pissed off young dudes with sticks and clubs and knives and whatever else you can wield with a human hand, completely free and heading toward a cluster of houses where a bunch of Georgian Jewish colonists made their homes. You know, it can be really easy, I think, in the developed world. It's easy for me, anyway, with our Delta Force and Navy SEALs and attack helicopters and aircraft carriers. It can be really easy to forget what war is at the bottom of everything. War is nothing more than, alright, you know what? I've had enough of this. Go find the men in your group and tell them to get ready, because our men are coming to see you, and we're going to find how this problem gets solved. That's all war is. You get your men together. Our men are coming to see you." End quote. I want to translate and crystallize what he just said, because I think it's important. Cooper is characterizing a mob of men walking to a bunch of Jewish houses with the intent to kill people, not just the men inside them. I'm talking kids, women, and entire families, and they do kill kids, women, and entire families, and do a lot more, and he's framing this as war. This is war to Cooper. I think it's really important for you to understand how someone views conflict and how a conflict is legitimized in their mind, because it helps you understand the lens through which they view the world, and I think this is one of those moments. And of course the mob descends on these houses and kills the civilians that they find within them on that fateful day. The violence spreads throughout almost the entirety of Palestine to outlying towns and villages well beyond the walls of Jerusalem, most notably in Hebron on August 23rd when rioters killed 68 Jews. The British police chief of Hebron, who Cooper quotes directly, was Raymond Cafarata, and here's a description of events as he saw them that fateful day in Hebron. Quote, "On hearing screams in a room, I went up a sort of tunnel passage and saw an Arab in the act of cutting off a child's head with a sword. He had already hit him and was having another cut, but on seeing me, he tried to aim the stroke at me, but missed. He was practically on the muzzle of my rifle. I shot him, low in the groin. Behind him was a Jewish woman smothered in blood with a man I recognized as an Arab police constable named Issa Sharif from Jaffa in Mufti. He was standing over the woman with a dagger in his hand. He saw me and bolted into a room close by and tried to shut me out, shouting in Arabic, 'Your Honor, I am a policeman.' I got into the room and shot him." End quote. Historian Tom Segev in his book One Palestine Complete speaks to the violence. Quote, "In a letter to the High Commissioner, the Jews of Hebron described other atrocities. 68-year-old Rabbi Meir Kastel and 70-year-old Rabbi Zvi Drabkin, along with 5 young men, had been castrated. Baker Noah Immerman had been burned to death with a kerosene stove. The mob had killed pharmacist Ben Zion Gershon, a cripple who had served Jews and Arabs for 40 years. They had raped and killed his daughter as well. Yitzhak Abu Jizdid and Dovnikov had been strangled with a rope. Yitzhak Abu Hannah, 70 years old, had been tied to a door and tortured until he died. 2-year-old Menachem Siegel had his head torn off." End quote. It's worth noting that Hebron's Jews lived there for generations, and many of them weren't even Zionists. This doesn't sound like a war to me. I don't know how anyone could see this as war. This sounds exactly like a pogrom. And I think most people would probably agree with that. This isn't anywhere in the realm of what you would expect warfare in our modern conception of it to look like. If you want to talk about a medieval world, before we had things like international law, sure, maybe you're right. Maybe this is warfare at its basest form, where you annihilate communities and kill children with swords. But that's not what warfare is today. That's not what that word means. Jewish settlements throughout Palestine came under attack and saw similar scenes. To end the slaughter, the British had to bring in reinforcements from Egypt, and when they finally had managed to get a grip on things by August 29th, 133 Jews and 116 Arabs were killed. When you look at what actually happened versus how Cooper describes things, it's hard to come away with the perception that he's doing anything other than trivializing the snowball of events that eventually reaches a crescendo of killing. I say this because there's some critical context and build-up to these events in 1929 that Cooper leaves out. Historian Benny Morris does a really good job when it comes to highlighting this period, so we're going to refer to him as we go through this. As Morris says, in relation to political developments within Palestinian society, quote, the 1920s saw a two-clan system emerge, with the dominant Husseinis challenged by their traditional rivals, the Nashashibis. The Husseinis, who controlled the Palestine Arab Executive and the Supreme Muslim Council, established an immediate edge, turning the Nashashibis and their allied notable clans into the opposition. Generally, the opposition espoused a willingness to cooperate with the government and occasionally let it be understood that they would compromise with the Jews. End quote. Morris goes on, quote, the struggle between the two coalitions of clans and opposition ascendancy in 1927-28 in part prompted Amin al-Husseini's campaign against the Jews and the violence of August 1929. By exploiting religious passions, he hoped to sway the Muslim masses to back his camp. End quote. So, right here, we have some political motivations on the part of Husseini and the Supreme Muslim Council to actually incite violence against the Jews, which is corroborated by the fact that the Jews blamed Husseini for initiating the carnage. In fact, Morris even tells us that literature was distributed to Arabs in advance of the violence. Quote, leaflets which seem to have been printed before August 14th were distributed by Husseini activists in nearby Arab towns and villages, enjoining them to attack Jews and to come to Jerusalem to save the holy sites. One flyer, signed by the Committee of the Holy Warriors in Palestine, stated that the Jews had violated the honor of Islam. End quote. The pamphlet goes on to encourage Muslims to rise up in war, jihad, and rebellion, and to awaken their religious feelings and national zealotry. Remember back in episode 1, when Cooper said this conflict had nothing to do with religion, and was strictly political? Seems rather myopic, in hindsight. Cooper even contradicts himself more directly this episode when he says, quote, what had started out as a dispute between Zionists and Arab nationalists had morphed into a religious fight between Muslims and Jews. End quote. So, in summary, we have witnesses saying that Husseini aggravated the crowds, we have political motivation for Husseini to have riled people up, and we have Husseini-aligned groups distributing inflammatory pamphlets before the violence broke out. It's clear that this was intentional, it was planned, and it was the desired outcome. And yet, despite all of this, Cooper dives on a grenade to reduce Husseini's importance in all of this when he says, quote, the Grand Mufti did try to stop the violence. Obviously, he had played a role in fostering the feeling that was leading to it, but now he's trying to stop it. He didn't intend for this to happen, but he lost control of this Frankenstein monster that he'd been conjuring. He'd been a thorn in the side of the Zionists, but he'd always worked with the British to prevent the frustrated Arab peasants from becoming violent. End quote. I mean, sure. I think given everything that we've covered, if someone had the field of vision of Helen Keller, I think it's pretty easy for a person to reach the same conclusions as Cooper here. In addition to Husseini's motivations, there's also some build-up surrounding the Western Wall that Cooper leaves out that's material for us to consider. Benny Morris provides some insight here. Quote, in 1928, the Muslims sought British confirmation of their traditional rights at the Wall. After all, they owned the Wall and the adjacent passage where the Jews worshipped. The campaign launched by Haj Amin in October included an international Muslim Congress in Jerusalem, and new construction next to and on top of the Wall in the Haram. Bricks occasionally fell on the Jewish worshippers below. Mules were driven through their praying area, often dropping excrement, and the Temple Mount criers turned up the volume on their calls to prayer. The government failed to intervene, and the Zionists turned the affair into a point of national honor, much as for the Muslims the conflict over the wall came to symbolize the struggle against Zionism. End quote. So the wall itself as a religious symbol had been treated, literally, like excrement. This buildup is missing from Cooper's telling of events, and it provides a lot of missing context as to why there were years of tension surrounding the Western Wall in the lead-up to 1929. Including this is important if anyone is trying to give you the full picture. It goes without saying that nothing of this magnitude had happened in Mandatory Palestine before. There were, of course, the Nebi Musa and Jaffa riots that we discussed previously, but the scale of the violence in 1929, the number of people killed and injured, it simply wasn't comparable. What happened in 1929 marked a turning point in the trajectory of this conflict. In the aftermath of the Nebi Musa riots, a Jewish paramilitary force had emerged, the Haganah. These were bands of Jews with weapons that were relatively loosely organized. In 1929, there were exchanges of fire between the Haganah and Arabs in places where they had the numbers to try to defend themselves and other Jews. In the wake of 1929, we see a surge in support for revisionist Zionism, the right-wing faction led by Zev Jabotinsky, who had argued in favor of building a strong Jewish military posture, the idea outlined in his famous Iron Wall essay. In fact, just 2 years later, in 1931, the Irgun was founded. It emerged out of a split from the Haganah, driven by the belief that Jews were in an existential struggle, not only with Arab militants, but also with the British, who were increasingly seen as unreliable or even obstructionist in relation to bringing the Balfour Declaration to life. The Irgun rejected the Haganah's policy of defensive restraint and instead embraced a doctrine of offensive retaliation. Many Jews who weren't on the right but may have been on the fence about Zionism in Palestine adopted Zionism as a result of 1929. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The violence of 1929 didn't just traumatize the Jewish community. It pulled segments of it further to the right, toward Jabotinsky's worldview. The mainstream Zionist leadership, figures like David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, still held the majority, and both men were deeply affected by the riots. But the rise of the right introduced a new, more militant current in Zionist politics, one that would have a lasting impact on the future of Mandatory Palestine. In the aftermath of the riots, the British did what they always do when something bad happened. They called a commission, the outcome of which was a paper known as the Passfield Report, which came to similar conclusions as the 1922 white paper issued by Churchill. It emphasized the importance of absorptive capacity and emphasized the need for restrictions on Jewish immigration and land purchases. Between this and the earlier white papers of the 1920s, it was clear that the British were cooling on their commitment to the Balfour Declaration, in which they promised the Jews a national home in Palestine. Episode 4 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem concludes with the end of the 1920s and the start of a new decade. The region has been rocked by unprecedented intercommunal violence between Arabs and Jews. It wasn't the first time that blood had flowed through the streets and alleys of the Holy Land, and it wouldn't be the last time either. We have 2 more episodes to cover in this mini-series, at which point we'll be exploring bold claims made by other influencers moving forward. We'll continue our critique of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem next time, and we'll keep holding those making extraordinary claims accountable to the historical record. That brings us to the end of episode 5 of Crackpot History. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, feel free to share it with someone that you think would get something out of it as well. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.